I mean, you mentioned outages there. There have been several. Yeah. And we've actually spoken to an engineer who works at Twitter, and they said that the plumbing is broken here and it's on fire and there could be problems at any minute. Do you accept that?
I mean, there have been a few outages, but not for very long, and it's currently working fine.
So it doesn't keep you up at night that Twitter might go offline again?
At this point, I think we've got a pretty good handle on what makes Twitter work.
Today, we're going to talk about Elon Musk. He did an interview with the BBC, and a guy named James Clayton was the interviewer. Greg, why don't you tell us about the videos we're going to watch?
Yeah, I'll be a little long-winded on this one unusually. First, this guy's been diagnosed with Asperger's, which today is not called Asperger's, but is autism spectrum disorder in the DSM. So we'll make sure we clear that up front. We may say Asperger's just because we forget. But there's an interesting thing. He did a really good Saturday Night Live episode, and you could see when he first started, he would do this steepling thing that I always tell you not to do. And as soon as he got to where he was comfortable, he'd move his hands. So we'll see some of that and figure out, is that an adapter or is it something else? My favorite line on the Saturday Night Live piece is when people were giving him a hard time about offending people. He said, I reinvented an electric car and I'm sending humans to Mars. Did you expect me to be a chill dude? So sense of humor is there. His illustrators and movement are typically awkward. You know, autism causes people to repeat moves sometimes, and we'll see a little bit of that, and causes them not to make hard eye contact very often. We're going to cover this from the beginning to the end. That's important because you see transitions in this interview, and that's the way we do all of our videos so you can see what's going on and changing. Now, I'll leave you with this. Why are we doing Elon Musk? We usually do criminals and politicians. Well, there's two comic book folks that are in movies that he could be one or the other of. Tony Stark, who is a benefactor to humans, or Lex Luthor. Lots of money, lots of technology. What does he do with it? We're going to look at his motivation as well as his body language and his behavior through this whole video.
Head count, so...
I mean, you mentioned outages there. There have been several. Yeah. And we've actually spoken to an engineer who works at Twitter, and they said that the plumbing is broken here and it's on fire and there could be problems at any minute. Do you accept that?
I mean, there have been a few outages, but not for very long, and it's currently working fine.
So it doesn't keep you up at night that Twitter might go offline again?
At this point, I think we've got a pretty good handle on what makes Twitter work. And we're also doing it with 2 data centers instead of 3. So we used to have 3 data centers. We shut down one of them, so we were actually roughly two-thirds of the prior compute capability. But we've made so many improvements to the core algorithm. In some cases, we improved the core algorithm by 80%. So the actual CPU usage or computer usage is dramatically less. But the results speak for themselves. The system, despite being at all-time highs of usage, is fast. It's responsive. It's more responsive than it was before the takeover. And we've also added long-form tweets. We've added, you can now post videos up to 2 hours and soon videos of any length. We're rolling out our subscriber programs so people can, content creators can actually make a living on Twitter by having some of their content behind a paywall. We open source the algorithm, so there's transparency about what tweets get shown, what content gets shown versus not. And I think you say, like, what are you really going to trust? Are you going to trust some sort of black box algorithm from some other site, or are you going to trust the thing that you can actually see and understand?
All right, Greg, what do you got?
Yeah, so we're going to see the beginning of a baseline. We always get told, these people who are not neurotypical, you can't read. But we can, because what we're doing is reading a baseline for a person who isn't neurotypical. And so this Asperger's or the spectrum person is going to have his own kind of baseline. But so what? So does Chase, and so do I, and so does Mark. Every time we look at a neurotypical person, they're different. So I want you to hear that when we first start. Musk starts with his hands braced on his knees and he's putting pressure down. That I associate with an adapter and discomfort in the beginning. And he does something that I think is part of his being on the spectrum. And that's that quick little hair thing he does every now and then, a repetitive move. I don't think it's an adapter. I think it's just part of what he does because I've seen him do it many times. I don't think that this guy who is our friend James Clayton, I think he's not necessarily truthful in a few cases on here when he says we talked to people who said this. And the reason I say that is because watch the way he starts to move. And we'll look at his hands, we'll look at him stammer and stutter and him change his cadence many times. But in this first one, let's just start paying attention to how he talks. When Musk is talking about, I think I have a handle on how this works, you see a little bit of distaste in his mouth. So I think he's been through something. We can't tell, but he's showing some signs of distaste or displeasure at that, as you see his mouth and his purses his lips. When he gets to the tech piece, I expect him to be very comfortable, but he isn't. He trails off and he uses a different cadence. His sentence structure changes. And when he's getting to 2 instead of 3, talking about redundancy in tech centers. So I don't know, is that because it was uncomfortable for him, but he surely shows some discomfort when he's explaining the tech. Then the questioner gets anxious to say something. If you want to watch, if you don't know that he's anxious, he touches his face several times. He does one inhale breath just before he touches his nose the last time, and that's him preparing to talk. So he's anxious to say something. And then we see this thing that he's going to do repeatedly, and that's touch his abdomen. And as things heat up, he's going to touch his abdomen more. And we associate that hand going to our body to barriers. Maybe it's something else in him, but I think that's what we're seeing. Chase, what do you got?
Yeah, typically we'll see when somebody's stressed out, in my experience, I don't think there is any peer-reviewed stuff on this, but that doesn't mean it's not real. So I would see hand to soft body tissue and soft body part areas like hand to throat or neck and hand to abdomen as meaning similar things. People do that during stress. But right away here, Elon makes a single shoulder shrug during his comment about people making a living off of their content. And we describe this as someone lacking confidence in what they're talking about. This is most likely his viewpoint on maybe what a living is, and not some deceptive statement about the app itself. The reporter or interviewer here is a mess. He's desperately exerting control over himself. And that's a lot of the stuff that you're seeing with his movements is self-control or self-regulation. And it's not even consciously listening to what Elon is saying, like at all. He's even nodding before a point comes out. He's itching and scratching, and these are common behaviors in somebody with excitement and stress alike. This is where the phrase, I'm itching to do X, came from, because we tend to do those behaviors. The rigidity and this constant movement of his arm is also signaling some discomfort. And you're going to see that again. And I want you to be able to spot it if you're watching this. And he's managing how he's being perceived, his posture, making sure that everything is kind of perfect. And the entire clip, this reporter is living in an area that I call behind the eyes. This level of kind of self-consciousness and anticipation is kind of overwhelming him and completely disconnecting him from any real connection here. And he also starts nodding all the time before Elon's even made a point. And it's kind of like an SNL skit, Greg, like you were saying a second ago. And I'm not sure if this was a last-minute thing where they had to borrow chairs from a cheap motel or not, but him having his phone out as a reference, as notes, just bizarre to me, noticing that. Scott, what do you think?
All right, yeah, speaking of cheap motels, I think that's where this interviewer stayed the night before and got cheap soap, because he's scratching everywhere you can scratch just about that you can do on video. I mean, he's scratching his face, he's scratching his stomach, he's scratching his leg. As we go through this, there are all kinds of places this guy's scratching. So pay attention to that. And I think quite often it might be his little adapters or signals to himself to say, okay, here I go, I've got to do this, or I'm waiting, or maybe he's adapting with them. I really can't tell because there's so many of them going on in there, but they're the same ones every time. Especially this, like you guys were talking about, let's keep an eye on that face and his chest right there, where he's or his stomach, where he's scratching on his stomach. I think this whole thing is really interesting because Elon pretty much is illustrating, and everything's really low. I think Mark will probably talk about that. They're really low and just above his knees. So for somebody who's got as much confidence as he does, I think that's fairly important, you know. And I think it's almost like a wind up to what's coming. I can't tell if he can tell what's coming or not, but he seems like he's prepped for this. He seems really prepared for what he ends up talking about. And he illustrates almost exclusively when he's talking about action or descriptive words. Quite often that's when we do it. But in this case, the only times he does it, pretty much when we go on, it changes a little bit. It's when he's describing something or using words that describe an action, that talk about an action or doing something. I think that little arm stretch where he does his arm like that, I think that's more of a tick than anything else. Initially, I thought it was an adapter, but I think it's might be a little habit he's got. But again, I think he was totally prepared for this thing. And when he says, I think we've got a pretty good handle on what makes Twitter work, this is where things get a little bit iffy for him, because that right arm goes from being relaxed and stuff, it goes to being braced. So he's getting ready to give his answer about what he thinks about Twitter. And I think we're seeing that internal dialogue go on in there, and he's guarding what he might really want to say. I don't think he's holding anything back, but I think he's thinking about all the problems he's had getting this thing up and running and learning it from where I'm sure they just left it sitting there and said, well, okay, there you go. You take care of that, smart guy. And he did, so that's also kind of awesome. And when Chase is talking about that single shoulder shrug, I think there are two, unless we're talking about the same one. That's when his right hand and arm go from being rested and relaxed and that bracing. That's when we see that little shoulder shrug as well. I think it's his left that we're seeing do that. I can't remember if it was the right or left you were talking about. So I'm not sure that he's completely confident with the answer, because I think he's got a lot of thinking going on. So when he delivers, I think we're seeing that a teeny bit of insecurity about the problems he was having with Twitter when they first got it up and running. He's probably revisiting those emotionally as he gives that answer. So I think that's why we're seeing the what we might assume to be not doubt, but not really being positive about what he's saying. Although I believe he's not lying or anything. He's being forthright, but I think he's just a little bit, I don't want to say insecure. I shouldn't say that, because he's probably not an insecure guy, I wouldn't think, but a little bit unsure about himself at that point. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, so as a good generalization, his limbs tend to be quite relaxed. The arms are relaxed down in what I would call the grotesque plane below the belt line, until he does brace or he gets passionate and his arms come up to the chest height. You'll see that in a few clips' time. It's quite a busy baseline. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on with both of them. Watch out for that steepling. Watch out for when he moves from relaxed arms to bracing. There's also a very interesting bent thumb action that goes on quite a lot. I think that's about his thought process and not quite, and that stress and tension of the thought process going into his thumb, maybe his neurotype as well. One last thing I'll just say about this as we go through it and we look at the debate that's going on. As a good rule, if you're going to a knife fight, you should really take a knife, and you probably want quite a sharp one. And we're going to see somebody who has no tools at all showing up to this particular fight that evolves over time. So watch out for that. We'll be talking about that as well. That's all I got on that one.
All right. If you don't know who we are, we're the Behavior Panel. And I'm Scott Rouse. I'm a body language expert and analyst, and I train law enforcement in the military in interrogation and body language. I created the #1 online body language course, bodylanguagetactics.com, with Greg Hartley. Mark?
I'm Mark Bowden. I'm an expert in human behavior and body language, help people all over the world to stand out, win trust, gain credibility every time they communicate, including some of the leaders of the G7. Chase.
Hey, I'm Chase Hughes. Did 20 years in the U.S. military, published a #1 best-selling book on behavior profiling, influence, and persuasion. And I teach those things to everybody today. Just type my name in the App Store to get training. Greg
Hartley. I'm a former Army interrogator, interrogation instructor, resistance interrogation instructor. I've written 10 books on body language and behavior, put together the #1 body language tactics course with Scott, and I spend most of my time in business.
One of those tape replays.
Head count. So,
I mean, you mentioned outages there. There have been several.
Yeah.
And we've actually spoken to an engineer who works at Twitter, and they said that the plumbing is broken here and it's on fire and there could be problems at any minute. Do you accept that?
I mean, there have been a few outages, but not for very long, and it's currently working fine.
So you don't. It doesn't keep you up at night that Twitter might go offline again.
At this point, I think we've got a pretty good handle on what makes Twitter work, and we're also doing it with 2 data centers instead of 3. So we used to have 3 data centers we shut down one of them. So we were actually at roughly two-thirds of the prior compute capability. But we've made so many improvements to the core algorithm. In some cases, we improved the core algorithm by 80%. So the actual CPU usage or computer usage is dramatically less. But the results speak for themselves.
One of those tape replays.